If you like audiobooks or audio shows, check out a free trial of Audible. Just click the link in the description.
Welcome to MINDSHOCK. What I'm going over today is one of the most important aspects of conspiracy theory, and for some reason, quite possibly the most misunderstood aspect of coincidence theory. The coincidence theorists, for whatever reason, just obviously logic not their strong suit if they're always dismissing everything as coincidence, but one of the mechanisms that they don't understand and by which they do the dismissal is a concept known as plausible deniability. And now, obviously, within circles of government, this concept is well known and well utilized for many, many decades now, if not centuries, if we're considering the way that governments hoodwink their populace. As always, if you like the podcast, you can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description, helping us get out even more mind-shocking podcasts at a faster frequency and get more co-podcasters to donate their time and energy to discussing the most mind-shocking topics and true crime cases out there. If you like the podcast, hit the like button, share it across social media platforms. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit the bell for notifications, and make sure your device allows those notifications to come through. Otherwise, you won't get them. You can find us on Twitter, Reddit, Facebook, Patreon, and patrons do get priority for topic and true crime case requests. Questions, comments, thoughts, theories, suggestions, rebuttals, debunkings, comments of any kind, leave them in the comment section. So let's jump into it. What exactly is plausible deniability? If you've been living under a rock on Mars, you might not have heard the term. But in short, plausible deniability is basically just having an innocent explanation for something, i.e., to plausibly deny something by providing an alternative plausible explanation, something within the realm of possibility that's not true, but it explains one's presence or actions. For example, one of the easiest things probably is people going out at night, going to bars, going to nightclubs. If they're not they want to take somebody home, they're not going to admit that. That might look kind of unladylike or ungentlemanly, depending on which social circles one travels through. So just saying, oh, you're just out on in town with your friends, not specifically to meet a significant other. That's plausible deniability. In government form, for example, this is used all the time in surveillance. If you're using some kind of an ice cream truck, a flower delivery service. These things are old and tired, so they're kind of cliche now. But these, especially in the past, they were plausible that some kind of a delivery van or something might be parked in a certain neighborhood when it was actually government agents surveying somebody. So, yeah, that's the general gist of plausible deniability. So coincidence theorists simply desperately grasp to the idea that if there were some kind of conspiracy going on, that under no circumstances would any kind of plausible deniability be used to cloak the conspiracy. It's downright hilarious how bereft of logic and reason some coincidence theorists are. But for example, anytime there's an anomaly per se, and they come out with a so-called debunking that there's a conspiracy, the coincidence theorists immediately take on face value that whatever the explanation for the anomaly is, there's no way it could have been an engineered plausible deniability situation. Plausible deniability could have been thought of ahead of time by people who are in the business of creating plausible deniability and conspiracies. There's no way they would have covered any kind of conspiracy. Any kind of conspiracy and any kind of anomalies, they would all be left uncovered at all times. So it would be bleeding obvious to all that if there were a conspiracy, it could not be covered in any way. So this kind of insanity is what coincidence theorists cling to desperately to try to maintain and justify their indoctrination into the cult of state and authority worship or expert worship, where they just pray at these altars of so-called experts, where anytime they use something to explain away an anomaly, the coincidence theorists, they just don't have that mental capacity to understand how plausible deniability could play into a scenario. Now, of course, that doesn't mean any conspiracy is true. This is MINDSHOCK, where the only thing we know for sure is that we don't know anything for sure. I am not alleging that any conspiracies are true in any way. I'm just pointing out the fallaciousness, logically, in dismissing any and all anomalies or inconsistencies as mere coincidence all the time, which is obviously the staple of coincidence theorists and how they cling desperately to coincidence theory and official narratives. Obviously, a quick stroll through memory lane for any kind of historians will show how often official narratives turned out to be legitimate throughout history. Little clue here, not that often. Now, it's almost like a boy that cried wolf situation. Of course, there are things that might look like conspiracies and not be conspiracies. But if you're erring on the side of caution, it's really not outlandish to believe that there are corrupt humans out there. There are greedy humans out there. I don't know why coincidence theorists have such trouble understanding basic human nature, and that sometimes shady individuals don't always work alone. Sometimes criminally minded individuals work together to further agendas. Obviously, anybody not new to humanity knows these basic things, but for whatever reason, coincidence theorists just have such a hard time with it. But focusing on plausible deniability, what are the covers here? Let's look at the chemtrail situation. So obviously chemtrails have been geoengineering, aerosol spraying. This is all admitted now, but a decade or so ago, the coincidence theorists just really, really chastised critical thinkers, aka conspiracy theorists, who were logically pointing out the differences between contrails and chemtrails. So by one of the things that governments do, of course, they change the terminology. So they won't necessarily come out and say, oh yeah, chemtrails are real. They'll come out saying, well, of course, aerosol spraying and geoengineering, I mean, that exists. That's been on the books. They'll never explicitly say that's what chemtrails are. So those bereft of logic and reason, aka coincidence theorists, they'll just eat that up and pretend that the conspiracy theorists weren't correct and saying, well, these aren't simply just contrails, because obviously aerosol spraying and geoengineering, that's not exhaust. These are admitted chemicals being sprayed into the air for certain purposes. Now, of course, the coincidence theorists and those hopelessly indoctrinated into the cult of authority worship, they will always take on face value whatever corrupt profiteers say, no matter how many times they've been caught lying in the past. So if they say, oh, it's just, it's to prevent global warming or whatever, they'll just eat that right up without actually using any kind of critical thinking, deductive reasoning, logical analysis, anything like that. So they'll pretend that's what it was and it was always innocent. Whereas chemtrails, so obviously certain hardcore conspiracy theorists were making certain allegations on what specifically chemtrails were and what they were being used for. I'm not going to get into any kind of that conjecture, but obviously it was a fact that there were non-contrail trails in the sky. Non-exhaust from airplanes was being sprayed in the sky, aka chemtrails, chemical trails. So that's a fact that chemtrails were and are real. Now, exactly what they're doing, whether they're poisoning the population or whether they're genuinely trying to prevent some kind of climate change or whatnot, and whether or not they're even capable of doing so, and those are altruistic in nature, that's besides the point. The point that coincidence theorists always fail to acknowledge is that the conspiracy theorists were correct. There were non-exhaust trails in the sky, known as chemtrails. All right, so the plausible deniability, of course, came out in the way of, oh, this is geoengineering, aerosol spraying, etc. So another point that the coincidence theorists, they really have trouble with these basic logical concepts. If there were an agenda, and obviously I'm not saying there is, I'm not saying there's evidence there is, but if there were, let's just use a little bit of common sense here, not even any kind of advanced critical thinking or deductive reasoning here. If there was an agenda, these government authorities with billions and if not trillions of dollars dedicated to these programs, they really wouldn't have a plausible deniability setup in place to explain away the conspiracy. Really? I mean, coincidence theorists are just so silly in that regard. They think if the conspiracy were true, there would be absolutely nothing to explain it away. I mean, can you get sillier than that? I mean, I don't know what's more mind-shocking, the conspiracy itself, or that there are supposedly functioning adult humans out there that are this gullible. It's just really bizarre. Obviously, if there were a certain type of conspiracy, obviously there would be plausible deniability built into the conspiracy, planned ahead. And it wouldn't even have to be that extreme plausible deniability. It could be something silly like a flower delivery truck being parked outside a particular residence for weeks on end. It could be that. So many people have fallen for that before. They don't even need to really think that hard to set up plausible deniability scenarios. And this goes for many different conspiracies. And you could kind of see it if you go on Metabunk, or if you look at some of the publications like Skeptic or Skeptoid, whatever. The so-called debunkings done by either government shills or just coincidence theorists who really do not have a good handle on logic, reason, basic human psychology, history, all of these things, they're just that clueless about it. They'll attempt to debunk certain conspiracies by using explanations that would easily fall under plausible deniability. They would explain away using these terms. They would obviously have a way to explain it away because they don't really want to be exposed by everybody at all times. People who have been following conspiracy theorists and various conspiracy theories over the decades, they can see the patterns of how all of this works. And obviously, some allege that there are definitely winks at the conspiracy theorists by certain perpetrators of conspiracies. They make them so ridiculous that they're unbelievable, almost like a game, like a serial killer sending a calling card to police or calling them or having just poking fun that they can't catch them. Obviously, in a lot of these conspiracies, the official narrative is intentionally so ridiculous, either violating laws of physics or just defying logic and just coming up with these unbelievable scenarios for the cognitive dissonant masses to just swallow on faith, suspending all logic and reason, almost like it's some kind of a game. And they'll pick some of the most ridiculous theories on what happened, why. I mean, obviously I don't want to get into the Sandy Hook theory here. I am not alleging that events do or do not happen, but certain reports were moving targets were shot 11 times with no misses. Where you have these, obviously that doesn't mean the event didn't happen. That doesn't mean these people weren't killed. That doesn't mean that the alleged perpetrator was not what the official narrative explains or states was. But some autistic individual having a 100% accuracy rating against moving targets while shooting some more than 10 times, is that believable? Is that believable even to an average individual, a low IQ individual? Would they believe that narrative? Now, obviously, mistakes are made. There could be clerical errors, but in certain reports that have taken more than a year or two to come out, if that official narrative is stated, who would believe such a narrative? Again, doesn't mean the event didn't happen, doesn't mean the exact same people didn't die, doesn't mean the perpetrator wasn't the perpetrator. But just reading through official reports, or like paper passports surviving during 9/11, so they find the paper passport, whereas supposedly the fuel of airliners melted through fireproof steel specifically designed to withstand many times the temperature of the fuel. So with these official narratives, there does seem to be a certain winking by the perpetrators of these conspiracies. If they are conspiracies, again, doesn't mean the event didn't happen. There's obviously the coincidence theorists desperately try to employ black and white logical fallacies and false dichotomies to try to dismiss any kind of critical thinking or logical assessment. Anybody who's not willing to be a lemming running off the cliff and just taking on blind faith as gospel truth, whatever authorities peddle at all times, they have to pretend these individuals advocating for logic and truth are simply completely insane and denying the event as a whole. Obviously, that's not what's going on. The burden of proof is always on the one making the claim, and you are not called upon to prove a negative. Otherwise, of course, we would all have to believe that there's an invisible flying spaghetti monster in the sky that we need to pay homage to. Otherwise, they will cause natural disasters, and we need to give them all our money. So why would we believe that? I mean, the burden of proof is always on the one making the claim, and you are not called upon to prove a negative. For whatever reason, coincidence theorists just really do not understand these basic concepts of logic and reason. They do not understand a plausible deniability. Once again, if we look at 9/11 real quick, there was supposedly a training exercises that morning. NORAD was shut down for a training exercise. Is that plausible deniability enough for the coincidence theorists? Of course it is. It is. But for critical thinkers, they're going to say, wait a second here, that does not seem right. Is it plausible within the realm of possibility? I don't know. Even that is a stretch, because if it's never been shut down before, and the only time it's ever been shut down was on the morning of 9/11, I mean, is that covered under plausible deniability? I would say no, but for the coincidence theorists, for them, it's plausible enough. It's plausible enough. So understanding, of course, not only basic logic, logical fallacies, human psychology, historical context, which, of course, plausible deniability falls in under this entire umbrella of, if there were a conspiracy, how would it be carried out and how would it be denied? If a coincidence theorist is not prepared to ask those questions, they cannot claim to be a logical, rational human being. They cannot claim to have a fully functioning brain, because they're just worshiping at the altar of the cult they were indoctrinated into if they're unwilling to ask these questions. There's a common saying, trust but verify. I would amend that, just based on human psychology and history: distrust and verify. I think that's a little bit more apt, particularly in the times we're living in now, with the internet available to document the history of the accuracy of government official narratives, of mainstream narratives, of news peddled on mainstream networks. Even just over the last few years, how accurate has it been? And then if you really want to do some studying, go back decades, if not a century, and track the accuracy. I'm going to round out this podcast with another saying. I'm sure most of you have heard it. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. So if you were fooled and hoodwinked, if you can get your ego in check, you can prevent it from happening again. Whereas if you can't get your ego in check, if your Dunning-Kruger is too extreme, where you cannot honestly analyze your own competency due to your own incompetence, which is, of course, a lot of that has to do with the human ego. So there's a certain amount of basic psychology that anyone interested in any kind of truth in any way should be examining. So if mainstream and official narratives fooled the population many, many times over, the first time, you can blame them. But what about after that? what about after that? If you trust distrustful sources, who is that on? If you know that they're distrustful, if you've been fooled before. Many, many questions to ponder, as always, on the MINDSHOCK podcast. If you enjoy the podcast, you can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. Make sure to subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell for notifications. If you like the podcast, hit the like button. Share it across social media platforms. Comments, thoughts, questions, rebuttals, debunkings of any kind, leave them in the comment section. You can also check us out on Twitter, Reddit, Facebook, Patreon. This is Bruce McGuire signing off. Catch you guys next time.